Welcome to episode 108 of the Daniel Yoris podcast with today's guest, Dr. Joe Baker. Let's go. Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. Joined here today by Dr. Joe Baker. Dr. Baker, thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure to speak with you again after many years. You're one of my professors. Not sure that you'd remember me in a sea of lecture hall of many people, but I certainly remember you. So thank you so much for being here. It's great to reconnect.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
I want to start off with a quote that you said at the end of one of the, I don't remember which course it was now, and so maybe that's a testament to the whole education system, but we do remember lots of things from school. This is one thing you said at the end of one of the courses. You are not limited by your biology, but by your resilience and your willingness to work hard. And that is something that, I don't know if you came up with that or if that's taken from somewhere else or either way, but that's something that I remember I wrote that down on my phone that day, and it's been like a pinned note on my phone ever since then. Probably a really great way to sum up your entire book almost.
Yeah, I think so. And that's been our philosophy. I think if anything for me has changed, it's our biology does constrain us a little bit when we talk about people at the absolute limits of human function. But the majority of us are so far away from that hard work, resilience, effort, those kinds of things are really the difference makers in terms of people and the things that they're able to do. So I still stand by that quote, even after writing the book and diving deep into the biology stuff. I think that's a good takeaway message for everybody. If you want to get better at something, work a bit harder, figure out how you can put more effort in a smarter way. All of those kinds of things are the big difference makers. Yeah,
I totally agree. And quite honestly, the podcast could end right there, and that's the whole message. But you referenced the book, and just to give a little bit people some context, tell us about the book and how it kind of came about and all that.
Sure. So after doing research in this area I've been at York for almost 20 years now. And so working with organizations and teams around the world and high performance athletes, this issue of talent keeps coming up, and it ran counter to what we knew about athlete development and human development, which is the hard work and effort and, time on task is the more important variable. But a lot of people think about talent as being the limiting factor. And so I wanted to do a bit of a deep dive into that area, and come up with some conclusions that we could make. And so this was really, it's almost the capstone of 20 years in this area, but the focused work in the area of talent maybe over the last 5 or 6, just so we could have a book. And it's different than any other book that I've written. And this one's written for coaches. It's written for parents and practitioners. It's not written for scientists. And so I wanted to be able to distill all of that sort of technical scientific knowledge into something that parents and coaches and practitioners could read and actually take away, some recommendations.
Yeah. And I think that was very evident in the book. I read through most of it, not all of it yet in preparation for this, and just my own curiosity and knowledge in your work. The book is called The Tyranny of Talent, showing just on the video here for everyone listening. Available everywhere books are available.
It's on Amazon right now. I published it through my own publishing company that I created because, we could, there's a whole rabbit hole about publishing. But for me, it was a smarter decision to go that route and keep the costs down and get more people reading it. But Amazon is the best place to get it at the moment.
Right. Makes sense. And I think that relating this to, the most amount of people versus the researchers is probably the most applicable way to do this. People can argue about talent in the classroom or in the laboratory, but it doesn't actually matter because that doesn't impact, little Johnny who's playing hockey and his parents are yelling at him to skate faster because he's whatever, and he's only 9 years old. That's where this whole concept of talent and the application of it and how we understand it in the real world really comes about. And as Canadians, I'm sure many people who were told from a young age that they either have it, they're going to the NHL, they're the next Wayne Gretzky, and then didn't pan out, didn't even really make it very far. And then there were some people who were told that they have it and kept pursuing that route, even though the dream in all reality was very far gone. And so I think that and I'd like to get your thoughts on this, is some of the dangers of early talent identification, where you plant this seed in a child's head that turns out to not be realistic. And so I just want your thoughts on that and how that kind of impacts athletes and society as a whole.
Well, I think that's the complexity that we're dealing with, right? Like, because there are examples of, the Connor McDavids, the Sidney Crosbys that were identified really young as being absolute superstars and ended up becoming absolute superstars. So like, we have examples of these cases. And I think too often we focus on the ones that fit the model that we have, and not the ones, there was probably a dozen other ones that were identified at the same time as McDavid or Crosby that didn't pan out. We focus on, it's classic confirmation bias. We find the ones that fit what we think is the way the world works, and we forget about the majority of them that don't fit that mold. And so that was kind of the message in the book, was there's power in these labels that you put on kids when they're young. And so you better be right in terms of the way that you're talking about those kids, because the consequences of a bad label are pretty profound and pretty consequential. And so, that was one of the big chapters in the book, is the power of these labels. Not, I think the beneficial part, some people, when they're told that they have talent, is a great thing for their motivation and their focus and those kinds of things. But it's the opposite when you tell a kid at, under 7, under 9, under 11, I don't think you have talent. That label sticks. And most of the time when people make those kinds of forecasts and decisions early on, they're not correct, because talent isn't something that you can identify that early in a lot of situations, especially for complicated sports like ice hockey or soccer, or, where the level of complexity is so much bigger than, say, 100-meter sprinting or, long jump, where maybe we've got that distilled down to some pretty key physical variables. Complicated team sports, different animal altogether.
That's something that you put that chart in the book, and I very clearly remember that from class years ago now, about the accuracy of talent identification through the draft system. Now, I don't know if you've done this or have any data on this or just ideas on it, but there's not really a draft system for sports like track and field, where it's very objective. You're either fast or you're not. There's no, special moves, or you've got that flair, or the other intangibles that may not be objective measures of quality at the sport. So do we see better talent identification in those more objective sports? And then I think a third, just to continue going on this thought tangent, a third sort of classification of sport may be the very objective things like track and field, then team sports where there's a lot of complexity, but a very clear objective as far as winner or loser. You scored more goals or less goals. And then the third pool being sports where there's a lot of judgment in the scoring criteria, like gymnastics or snowboarding or those kind of sports. So do we see like a downgrade in talent identification across those things due to the objectivity of the sport?
It's tough to know, because to a certain extent, they're apples and oranges, right? Like, the ecosystem of development for athletes in those different sports is very different. The depth of competition is different. Like soccer, it would be hard to pick another sport that has that depth of competition internationally. And so it's tough to actually put them on a level playing field and evaluate them relative to each other. But I think that emphasizes the importance of understanding the overall system as a whole, because oftentimes what happens is national sport governing bodies will have one model. So Own the Podium in Canada, for example, will say, we want everybody to follow this model. Well, for some sports, that model works. For other sports, it doesn't work at all, because the depth of competition is different. The number of athletes coming in the stream, if we think about the classic sort of athlete development pyramid, for some sports, it's not a pyramid, it's a silo. They need to nurture everyone that comes in the system, because they can't afford anybody to leave. Because if they leave, then it undermines the whole system. So even in track and field, sprinting, maybe distance running, we got lots of numbers for athletes in those things. Maybe throwing sports, the numbers are a lot less. So even within one category of sports, there's lots of nuance that we need to be aware of.
Right. And this makes it it just makes it difficult to navigate this as a as a parent, I often think about, when I watch the Olympics and there's some of the less common sports, mainly not the team sports. And I think about who started doing this when they were 8 years old, whose parent was like, hey, you should go be a discus thrower rather than play soccer or baseball or whatever. It seems like, not that it's wrong, but it seems obscure. And so people find these sports by some mechanism. And like you said, there's not a really big pool of people playing this. So the competition is lower, but that also makes it harder to get better, because another thing that you reference in the book is that we need the sort of not pro athletes but almost there to push everyone and make the level of the sport higher. So if you're a discus thrower and you have one person you're competing against in every competition in the province of Ontario, it's like, well, you're coming second place no matter what. So you'll have hundreds of silver medals, but your level of competition might not be that high. And so when you get to a more international stage or a larger stage, you're like, oh wow, these guys or girls they're like really good. I thought I was good, but I was only better than Johnny, who's my neighbor. So it makes it very difficult to progress in the sport.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's in the book, I think one of the takeaway messages is we need to focus more on optimizing the developmental environment for all the athletes that are in there. And if we figured that out, then we wouldn't have these sort of big fish, little pond situations where you look like an absolute superstar until you actually put yourself into a position where you're not the big fish in a little pond. And if you haven't developed coping skills, if you haven't developed skills to be able to make that transition, then human behavior would say you're not going to be motivated to make that. Later in the pathway, when you're doing well and then you absolutely start getting crushed, that's not motivating. Why would anybody want to stick around there? People that do, they have some sort of coping skills that allows them to make that transition. So I think those, that's the complexity of athlete development that we're talking about. There isn't a one size fits all model that'll span across sports, but even across individuals. So we need to understand that complexity and that nuance a lot better than we do.
I think another kind of direction I want to start to lead people in here is understanding all of the other things that are maybe not so obvious as to what makes someone identified early. Things like the population size of the city and these like other external, birth month and these kind of things. But even one very good example I can say from my own life is I played soccer. That was my sport. And up till U9 or U11, I can't remember exactly what it is, but you play 7-a-side versus 11-a-side on the field. And so I remember there was a boy on my team who was, when we were 7-a-side, he was like the best player in the league, scored goals from half. He was just bigger than everyone, larger than everyone. I don't remember what when his birthday was, but he was the biggest kid in the league and he would score goals like crazy. And then the year that we transitioned to the larger field, he couldn't cope, couldn't run, was effectively useless in the game. And that's something that someone could have said, well, that guy is the next, next Messi, next Ronaldo. And then gets phased out really quickly. So I want you just to speak to some of these sort of like intangible things where, someone who's just in a larger body because they're taller or whatever, when they're younger, might get pushed into the pool versus like a December baby who's just smaller and doesn't get identified early. And what are the long-term implications of that?
Well, I think there's a couple of, big examples there. The one that you mentioned, that relative age effect, the difference in a 1-year age group between the oldest kid in that age group and the youngest kid. That difference, we see that show up in a lot of sports where there's a depth of competition and early selection, because what happens is coaches are more likely to think they see talent when in fact they see growth and development. And so the difference between those players has nothing to do with talent, and the fact that one, could be almost a year older than the youngest person in that group that they're being compared against. And so these things, we see these things at the end of the pathway, but they're really mechanisms that are happening at the beginning of the pathway. And those kinds of things have profound effects on an individual's long-term potential and long-term development, because being selected early, you get put into in ice hockey or in soccer, you get put into the representative group. You get better coaches, you get better training time, you play more competitions against better components. Well, those things are the things that make a difference in skill development and acquisition. And so being relatively older is an advantage to a point. And the interesting thing about that effect is if you're able to survive as a relatively younger player in those environments, then the data suggests that at the end of the pathway, they get drafted into the NHL earlier. In professional soccer, they end up making more money in their careers. So being younger in a disadvantaged environment does seem to be beneficial for the development of skill. Could also be that they had more talent. We don't know exactly, but it does seem like at the end of the pathway, the relatively younger players have an advantage by being in that disadvantaged pathway. Again, this is the complexity of what we think is a really simple effect, but not simple in any way. And so that relative age effect, I think, is a big one. The other one that we see, which highlights the value of the developmental environment, is the left-hander effect in a lot of sports. We see it in football as well. People that can kick well with their left foot dominant. In those kinds of situations they have an advantage because the majority of the population, sometimes up to 90% of the population, is right orientation. So the opponents get really good at seeing what a right oriented person looks like. Their brain gets good at making that adaptation. And when they see a left oriented person, they struggle. They don't make as good a decision. And so those people have an advantage. Again, they start at the same level of skill, but because of their rarity, they end up being more highly valued at the end of the pathway because they're harder to predict. They have greater likelihood of success. So how do you fix that? You fix it by optimizing the developmental pathway. These things that look like they could be stable differences, well, we can control them if we design a better pathway for people.
As far as designing a better pathway, would something to offset the relative age effect be shortening the year cycle? So instead of, all kids born in 2023 play together, it's kids born January to March in 2023 and then April to May or whatever it is. But I think the downside of that would probably be there's not enough kids to support that. So logistically, it wouldn't really work. But in theory, if there were enough people, it would work. Does that make sense? Or would we still see the relative age effect where kids in January would still get more than or be more selected than kids in March? It's a shorter window, but it still would exist across a large number, right?
Yeah, technically the window would just shrink, but the differences would still be there. You would hope the size of the effect would get smaller as well. But you've identified the problem, which is logistics and administration would make it so complicated. There's a reason we put people into 1-year age groups. It's to try to minimize those differences in competition. We do it in school as well to minimize differences in learning ability. So you could shrink it down into smaller groups. You could, you think back to the way education used to be delivered. It was everybody was in a single room. It didn't matter what grade you were in. The instructor would adjust the way that they delivered things so that people at different skill levels would be getting the instruction that they needed. I don't think we're ever going to go back to that system, but there was value in that approach because you're personalizing the delivery of instruction. We've gotten to this sort of mass production of athletes as our philosophy that we try to do everything we can so that we can deliver gross general messages to the whole group as opposed to individualized messages across each developing athlete. So I think it comes back to this, how would we optimize the learning environment for every single athlete under our care? We would do that with an individualized approach as opposed to these sort of general ones. That philosophy might actually take care of the relative age effect itself because we're not interested in you compared to the group. We're interested in you today as you were yesterday. Did you get better? And so whether you got better relative to the group is kind of irrelevant to that question. And
so to actually implement that, would you have to sort of have a team of 2023s and then during the practice, say their practice is an hour and a half long, maybe half of it is team, everyone together, and then another half of it is break off into groups based on relative age, or it may even be height, because a kid who's born in December could still be taller and bigger than a kid born in January, and that would, in most sports, effectively offset the relative age difference. But so separate it by somehow, and then let those kids kind of flourish together. Would that be a way to offset this and sort of implement the individual approach in team environment?
Yeah, I think that would be one way to do it. Another way to do it would be to remove the the administrative load on the coach and have the players, especially in youth sports. If you watch kids on a field playing soccer or baseball or whatever, they figure out a way to minimize differences between performance groups. So if there's one kid that's absolutely dominant, then, well, we're going to play 5-on-7 or, 4-on-8 or whatever. Like, they figure out a way to minimize that difference. And so oftentimes kids are better at figuring out those things and making it more equal than coaches thinking, well, we've got one administrative strategy and here's how we're going to do it. I think especially for youth, there's maybe more value in letting kids figure it out for themselves, because they probably do a better job of figuring it out, but it also shifts the autonomy towards the kids as opposed to the coach. And that personal autonomy is actually a really important psychological variable for us to develop.
That's so interesting that you say that, because I had never really thought about that, but it instantly brings back memories of, playing games at recess. And I was a soccer player. Of course, most kids in my class didn't play soccer at a high level. So it would be like me and another guy versus, everybody, the rest of the class. Yeah. Or we were playing basketball. There was the tall kids, 2 of them versus 9 other people or whatever it was. And that's so interesting how that works. Why do you think that we do that? Like, there's got to be some inherent psychological motivation for doing that. Is it simply just fairness and we like to be competitive? It's not fun to win a game 15-0 every time. It's fun once and then no longer. So is it some sort of inherent competition that we seek? Is that probably the reason that we do that?
I think so. And if you look at evolutionary theories of why we play and things like that, it's to develop skill, it's to develop competency and that kind of stuff. And like you said, we don't develop competency if we're winning everything. Like, if the task is too easy, then we don't get any reward from the task. And so we figure out a way to make the task just difficult enough that we're going to be challenged by it, but the likelihood of success is going to be there if we work hard enough. So there's this idea that it needs, we need to see success about 80% of the time. That means 20% of the time we're going to fail. And that sweet spot in terms of difficulty seems to be something that's really rewarding and motivating for us. And I think we see that in kids all the time. They don't want to win all the time. There's challenge in the losing. That's a really important part that I think we forget about when we design, especially youth sport environments, where we try to remove the score because we think that there's something value about knowing who's the winner and who's the loser. Kids always know who won. Yeah. And so by doing that, I think we undermine something that's really important in the way we deliver sport.
I used to be quite involved in coaching soccer, and it was during a time when the league, and it was just house league mostly, but it was transitioning from keeping score and standings to not keeping score and standings. I thought it was very strange. And what I saw, I also refereed as well. What I saw through this was that the kids always knew the score. They knew who was winning and losing. They knew who the best player on the field was. They knew who the best team was. Everybody knows what's going on. But the sad part and the reality that I observed was that this removal of the score and the standings was so that the parents wouldn't get too involved. And there's such a problem with parents getting in the way of kids' sports. Like, this was house league, and these kids were 12 years old. They had already not really been in the system. None of these kids were going to become professional soccer players. So they're all having fun, and that's all great, and I'm all for that. But none of them are becoming professional soccer players. But parents are getting in arguments, yelling, almost becoming physical with each other, yelling over scores. And so removing the scores and the standings was so that the parents would just chill out. But then that's at the expense of the kids. And so it's this whole problem of parents or adults getting in the way of kids' sports. And I think that's really sad, because the competition is part of the thing. You play the sport to have fun and to learn and all this stuff, but you play the sport to win. You don't play soccer just to go play. There is an objective to the game, and if there was no objective, that there would be no game. So I hate that's a thing, but it seems to be the reality. And again, it's just another one of these complexities that makes the whole athlete pathway much more difficult, is parents' over involvement in sport. And I think in some sports we see that less, and I would believe in Europe, I think it's actually a lot less than here, based on my experience playing soccer there, where parents are not allowed on the practice field. Parents are not allowed to yell instructions during the game, versus here that's not the case at all, and it causes a lot of problems. So there are definitely benefits to that system, and downsides to our system. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, I agree. And I think part of the problem that we have in North American sport is it's not that the parents are monsters. It's that they don't understand their role in the athlete development pathway, right? Their job in the athlete development ecosystem is not to be critical of the coach. They don't have the coach's knowledge of skill development and long-term athlete development. And so they should be quiet when they're talking about skill development. They're there to be the emotional support system for that athlete. So they should ask them how the game went, sit back and be supportive, all that kind of stuff. But if we don't have a clear role for parents to play in that pathway, they'll fill that role with what they think is the right one. Parents yelling from the stands is because they think their child is being disadvantaged, or they think it's the right thing to do, all those kinds of things. It comes from a position, and I think the majority of the time, there are some monsters out there, but the majority of the time they're doing that because they think it's the right thing to do. And that, for me, I think that's a limitation in our education of what parents' role should be. And so we can change that. We can change that through education. We're starting to see that in soccer and ice hockey, where they have almost parent code of conduct, which I think is the first step. Like, this is what you don't do. A better approach would be, this is what you do. Here's how you be a supportive parent for your child. It's not by yelling in the stands, but yeah, be there, be involved, be intense, but don't yell at other kids. Like, that's not the solution. And so I think, if we had a better understanding of what do we actually want parents to do to help in the skill development of their athlete, I think most parents would do it. It's just they don't have that information now. And so, they're filling a vacuum with what they think is the right decision, but it's the wrong one. The other thing, I think, to go back to your point about removing the score from sport, I think we forget that the way that we construct and deliver sport is competitive. And so, in our research lab, we make a big difference between exercise and sport. Sport is, you get all the physical stimulus of exercise, but you get more because of the way that sport is constructed. There's value in competition. Personally, measuring yourself against standards, measuring yourself against other people. That's not for everyone, but for the people that seek out sport, that is a really important element of what they're trying to get out of that environment. So when you remove the score and everybody gets a participation ribbon and all that kind of stuff, you're undermining the thing that makes sport unique and so valuable for human development. And so I think that, like, we're trying to really push back against that idea, because we don't want to sanitize sport. We don't want to make it exercise. There's something special about that element. How do we figure out what that is and deliver it in a more positive way? That's a different question than removing it altogether.
Was the push towards the participation trophy kind of idea simply about not hurting people's feelings? Is that what the push was towards? I imagine it wasn't based in any sort of talent or research. It doesn't seem to suggest in any way that it would produce better players, because it's also not seen in the competitive leagues. It's mostly seen in the house leagues and the younger leagues, where like the score and result doesn't really matter anyways, and it doesn't have to matter, but we should acknowledge that it's there. So was it just about like not hurting people's feelings? Is that where it came from?
I think probably. I don't know enough about the policy that went into thinking about that, but it's probably this idea that, we don't want kids to feel bad about their participation, which, again, from a developmental standpoint, that looks like a pretty pro-social message. We don't want kids to feel bad, because if they feel bad, they're not going to do sport. I think the opposite is probably the reality, which is they're going to feel bad. So teach them the skills to not feel bad about that. So use this as an opportunity to learn either psychological coping skills, or provide them with opportunities to develop technical skills so that they're seeing competence go up. Maybe enjoyment goes down a little bit because they lost, but if competence is going up because they're getting better, even though they're losing, then they're still going to be motivated to participate. So again, it's looking at this thing from too simple a perspective and putting all the eggs in the enjoyment basket. But that's only one thing that motivates us. If we see improvement, then win or loss doesn't matter. Think about runners and things like that. If you didn't win the race, but you set a personal best, then you still pull a success away from that experience. I think, we forget that kids are very resilient and they're designed to acquire these kinds of coping skills during childhood and youth that they're going to use for the rest of their life. And if we don't use sport as a way to help them develop those skills, I think we're missing a really, important opportunity.
Yeah, and it translates across sport, because if you've never lost in sport and you've never lost, let's extrapolate this a little bit, never lost in academia, you always, we stop giving grades on tests up until grade 12 or whatever it is. And then you get to university or you get a job and you don't get the job. You've never lost in your life. Like, you are going to be distraught. And that is not okay. It's almost like lying to kids, even though they know the truth, but you tell them it's not the truth, and it would probably create some sort of confusion, which leads me down another path of thought here, where when we speak to children in the athletic context, an example would be there's a girl who has, she plays hockey at a decently high level. Her shot is the weak spot of her game. So the mother's worried about, well, do I tell her that she has a weak shot, or do I phrase it as the shot is the part of the game, the part of your game that you need to work on most? And so there becomes this balance between, well, I want to frame things positively, but I also don't want to lie. Like, if the kid is really not good, then they're not good, and you can't tell them that they're the best forever, because eventually that's going to come crumbling down on them. But you want to frame this positively. So how do we go about balancing that positive attitude, but also maintaining some sort of reality?
Yeah, I think the way that I would approach that sort of situation is to talk to the coach, right? Like the parent coach interaction is a really important one. So it should really come from the coach, that technical feedback that the shot is weak, because, sometimes the parent might go to the coach and say, I can see that my daughter's shot is weak. And the coach will say, no, it's actually as good as we see at this level. So we don't want to give her that feedback, because giving that negative feedback has more consequence than forgetting about the shot, which is going to develop over time. So I think, let the coach be the determiner of the value of that information. Doesn't mean the parent shouldn't provide that information, but let the coach actually be the person that delivers that, because the coach could only be there for a couple of years. If the parent undermines the confidence that that child has, that stays around for a lot longer. And so, we want the parent to be the absolute cheerleader for that athlete, no matter what stage of development they're in. And so that's the damage, that's potential damage of that technical feedback, is you're undermining that, my mom or my dad always has my back. Well, let the coach be the one that delivers the bad news. The parent is always there to be that supportive, that supportive cheerleader. The problem comes in a lot of volunteer and even some of the high performance development system where the parent is the coach. That's a different situation altogether.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot less of that now. I know that for a lot longer in hockey, just because there's more of a system in Canada here. Anyways, that's been like AAA coaches for as long as I can remember have always been paid coaches who are not parents of kids on the team. But I know that we're starting to see it a lot more in soccer now. But the downside of that is it makes the sport more expensive, which then excludes some other kids and has like other downstream effects. Soccer, as a relatively cheap sport to play, is now costing parents several $1,000s to be in the top teams and in the top academies and whatever in Canada anyways. Whereas, one of the reasons why soccer is one of the most played sports around the world is because it is so accessible to everyone. And, we've all seen videos of kids in Brazil playing soccer with, rolled up plastic garbage bags as a ball, because they know they don't have shoes and on dirt ground. And, 10 years later, that kid is Ronaldinho. And so, we see that. But then when we start to see this issue of, okay, well, soccer registration for this year costs $5,000. Well, that's a pretty significant barrier to people. And one of these things where we don't realize that the best soccer player in Canada might never actually play soccer. One, because of economics. Two, because of maybe they're playing hockey, or maybe they're doing something else, right? And so that's another thing that I think, I like to talk to you about, is about the people that are the best may not be the best because of may not be actually the best. They just might be the best person who played that sport, right? Like the best hockey player could be someone in Africa. They'll never play hockey. So yeah, it's one thing to we trick ourselves in this talent thing, but we don't necessarily have an entire pool of the whole world to see who really is the best, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the way we often talk about the one that has the Olympic medal around his neck is, or her neck is, she's the best player that was identified by a system and was able to thrive. That doesn't mean she's the fastest runner on the planet, because that person might not have ever been found by a system. They might be living in the middle of Africa somewhere where they just don't get exposure to high performance sport. The best hockey player could be, the person with the most hockey talent, ice hockey here, could be growing up in the middle of Australia right now, but they're never going to see an ice hockey rink. And so, the other thing about that is people don't develop in a specific way that have a set of skills that could only show up in one sport. There's, I think we need to be thinking about sports in terms of categories. The demands of ice hockey, we can see those representative demands in other activities, and it's the training and the fine tuning of really specific skills that we'll see in an ice hockey player. But that ice hockey player at, U11, U13 could have been a rugby player, could have been a handball player. It depends on what system they come from. So I don't think we want to be careful about using this person that has talent that's only going to show up in hockey. Very rarely do we see that kind of thing. And the only really ones that I think are good examples of this is, well, if your peak height is predicted to be over 7 feet, well, then there's a really limited number of sports that you're going to be able to thrive in. Most of the time, the skills can transfer across sports. The more interesting thing, or maybe more important thing, is what does the athlete want to do? Because they're going to have to devote 10 years or 15 years of their leisure time and their non-leisure time to training for that sport. And so it doesn't matter if they're best suited for ice hockey. If they hate ice hockey and don't like to skate, then that's a terrible sport for them.
Yeah. Well, building off this, then, where does the term natural athlete exist in our vocabulary? Is it something that we should reference? Is it something that we should do away with? It's probably a term that people use without really understanding what it means. But how do we go about including or excluding this term from our conversation about athletics?
We're in the process at the moment of writing a paper to get people to stop using the word talent altogether. So natural talent, natural athlete, all that kind of stuff, because there's too much baggage that comes along with those terms. We like to say talent is a thing that it's a concept that we can use in science, because it really reflects differences between individuals that could affect their potential for future success. But when we try to use it in practice, it has more, I think it does more harm than good, because it focuses on talent as a capacity, as a thing that can be identified. And so instead of talent identification or talent selection, we're trying to move towards athlete identification and athlete selection, because it puts the person back into that discussion. And when you think about the task of selection or identification as finding a person as opposed to finding a capacity, it makes it a more nuanced kind of exercise and process that you're going through. A person isn't fixed. A person is developing over time. How they show up today is the result of experiences and opportunities that they've had. You start to make the process more complicated and more, I think, accurate in terms of reality than if you just think talent is a fixed thing that you can just, dial up in a recipe somewhere.
And if your research has shown anything, it's shown for sure that we're very bad at predicting talent and choosing talent as a across the board. And there's many, many reasons for that, but we just don't seem to be good at it. And no matter how many millions of dollars are poured into scouts and whatnot, there are things that go above that, and we're just not very good at it. Like an easy example, and probably everyone who's been involved in sport to some degree has an example of this, is like, it's also about who you know. If you just get the shot and you show up on that day, you have your best game on that day, you're significantly more likely to get into the system and take it where it goes. But say, you are the best player in the team, and the day that the scout shows up, you wake up on the wrong side of the bed, you're just in a bad mood for whatever reason, you don't have a good day, and then you're just, go off into oblivion, never play the sport again at a very high level. Like that is real and that happens. And so this natural athlete thing is like, or our ability to identify talent is just not very good because it's predicated on far too many things that one human can't even comprehend.
Yeah, and I think that, there's maybe two or three elements there. One is the potential that the athlete actually has on the day that they show up with. The other one is the absolute luck of being in the right place at the right time for that to even happen. So that, the athlete waking up on the wrong side of the bed, the scout just randomly seeing an athlete playing in a game that they weren't even planning to stop and watch, like all those kinds of things. We know that those things happen. The other one that I think is maybe more realistic and we forget is that this is a really complicated thing that we ask coaches to do especially at early developmental stages. We don't look at kids in grade 5 and say, well, there's our doctor right there, look at his score on a math test. But we'll do that in sport, right? Like these things have consequences that are much more profound and much more damaging in sport settings than in almost any other area that humans are involved in. And so we need to understand that this process has so many more ways of going wrong than it goes right. And so the likelihood is all of our selection decisions are going to be wrong, not because we're wrong, but because the thing we're trying to predict is so complicated and nuanced and unpredictable that the majority of the time those things are going to be wrong. And so for me, the more important element is if we have to make selections, and in a lot of sports we do because we don't have the resources to keep everyone, we don't have enough coaches at the highest levels to be able to provide, optimal skill-based feedback to everyone. So how do we make that selection so that it has zero implications and effects on the person that's deselected? For me, that's the more important question. And the more important issue is how can I tell you, you didn't make the team this year and it has zero impact on your ability and desire to practice tomorrow. For me, I think that's the area that we need to be searching in. How do I deliver that feedback in a way that doesn't seem like a career-ending piece of feedback to an athlete in the development system?
And the larger scope of that is also, what are the long-term implications of that kid's life thereafter? Forget about their athletic career, but their life. The last line in the book is, I'll read it off, is, given the low rates of youth engagement in sports and physical activity, high-performance systems should be doing everything they can to maintain all athletes' engagements at any level for as long as possible. And I absolutely love that because we see kids drop out of sport at 12 years old, maybe 14 years old when you start to get a part-time job or a boyfriend or girlfriend or, social stuff with your friend, and sport becomes less important. And then they just go down a different path. And now the health implications of this are no longer good. And so it's like, I used to be an athlete. So we have this idea that like we used to be healthy. And I'm sure we all know someone who's, 50 plus years old. Oh, I played football in high school. It's like, okay, yeah, but that was 35 years ago. Like you haven't run 35 years. What you did in high school doesn't impact, well, it does impact, but it doesn't dictate your health and fitness today if you haven't done anything. So we need to be able to keep people not necessarily in sport, but involved in fitness and health and activity for as long as possible for reasons far beyond athletics.
Yeah, and I think that's the focus of our research in our lab, right? Like we do a lot of work with high-performing athletes, but our overall mission is the power of sport in general. And so I think that's that's why the talent selection and identification part is so important, because it's almost that's the door that opens for a lot of people that leads to their exit out of sport. And so how do we manage that decision-making process better so that it's less likely to do that, so that people don't leave sport with a negative taste in their mouth about their sport experience? The reality is the majority of people in high-performance sport are not going to be the ones that emerge at the end, because the few that emerge is so small a number that most of the system is not a selection system, it's a deselection system. And so how do we ensure that those people don't leave sport hating sport and the experience that they had there? Because like you said, we know the cost of that, and it's decades sitting on the couch and being inactive and sedentary. We have a huge problem with that in our society, and I think the way we deliver sport could help. And if we focused on, again, optimizing environments for everyone, most people will recognize when they're not suited to the Olympics. And if we give that autonomy to them to say, you know what, when we deselect somebody, you say, here are the things that you did well. Here's why you weren't selected this year. This is where your gaps are. I want you to keep working on these things and maybe try coming back next year and trying out again. To do that, here's what we need. We need more investment from you. You're going to have to stop going out with your friends on the weekends if you really, really want this. If you give that agency to the person, they'll probably in an accurate way decide, you know what, this isn't for me. I don't want to sacrifice these kinds of things. It's not, it's not the be all and the end all for me. We give that agency to that person. They probably transition out of sport in a more positive way than that situation where the coach says, no, you're on the team, good luck with your life. And so I think, we could manage that a lot better, and it might help us at the end of life when we're looking for people to be more active so that we don't see this chronic disease burden in our older population.
This is, I think, speaks to the power of the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves. People who say things like, I'm not a good athlete, I'm part of the B team, or, go a little bit further into, regular life. I can't lose weight. I struggle to lift heavy weights. I struggle to eat healthy. If you continue to tell yourself this, and it is somehow validated externally by other people or whatever, then you start to believe that more and more, and it becomes harder and harder to break that cycle. So I think what you said there to highlight it is framing our shortcomings not as you're not good enough, but you're not there today, and here's what you can do to get there tomorrow or next week or whatever it is a very important way, I believe, to start to reframe, again, the stories that we tell ourselves. If someone struggles to lose weight, you may be struggling to lose weight right now, but here are the things that you might start to add or take away or change about your lifestyle that will help you to lose weight in the future. So you are not a person who struggles to lose weight. You are just currently struggling to do so, but that doesn't mean that that's the way it's going to be for forever. And so, again, I think we need to be careful about the way that we deselect from sport and deselect our traits from the rest of our life, and try to frame them positively, but with constructive criticism.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the messages that I tried to lay a foundation for in the beginning of the book when I put up those odds of success in the different professional leagues, like the likelihood of an pre-high school basketball player making it to the NBA is 1 in 70,000. Well, that means there's 69,999 people that are going to be deselected from that system. So how do we manage those people so that they don't grow up hating basketball? That should be our focus, because the 1 in 70,000, they're going to be motivated to stay. They're going to be more likely to be selected. The system is going to take care of them. The system needs to do a better job of taking care of those other 69,000 athletes that are going to leave, because we know the consequences of them leaving in a negative way, and they drop out of their sport. So I think, like you said, we can do a better job of managing these things, and the benefits of managing these things better are so much more profound than just interest in sport and buying NBA jerseys. No, this is the thing that's going to affect so many long-term health outcomes, that it's important from a sport perspective. It's important from a, human and ethical and social justice perspective, but it's also something that would help us solve some of these major social problems that we have in our society that we are not doing a good job of solving at the moment.
Yeah, I totally agree, and would encourage everyone to listen back to that section, because it's the most important thing. I've always said that sport has taught me more than most other things in my life, and when I actually think back to it, it's not stuff that I realized at the time, but it's stuff that I realized as I became an adult and reflected back on my life, and it's like, oh yeah, like there's a reason why I wasn't like doing drugs and partying in high school. It's because I had soccer practice on Saturday morning. And, not to say that's like an extreme example, not to say that I would have done that without sport, but like the temptation is there because I've got nothing else like really holding me back, parents and family and all that stuff aside. But maybe that was a bad example. I shouldn't have said that. But I think everyone understands the point of what I'm getting at there. One kind of spin-off of all of this stuff with sport is, I wonder whether esports and the emergence of esport and the ecosystem around esport breaks any of the rules, or does it seem to be following the same line of progression as other sports? Because there's not really organized leagues by governments per se yet, and it translates across ages all over the world. There's a lot lower barrier to entry than probably any sport to get into the system. Like kids in Brazil can play soccer with a garbage bag, but they might not be able to get into a system. But anyone with an internet connection can get into a league. So how do you see esports kind of developing, and where is it going? Does it change any of the rules of any of this stuff?
It's a really interesting phenomenon that we're seeing, develop at the moment. I gotta be honest, it's not really an area that I have much expertise in. But I think what's neat about esports, and I'm sure if we were to predict its evolution over time, is there's a link between physical fitness and physical capabilities and cognitive performance. So you can say esports is, it's not very active. They're sitting a lot. It's sedentary time. But if you're talking about the highest levels of performance, you need to be fit in order to be able to sit there for that long and attend. And so physical fitness might come as a foundation for that kind of performance, which is done in a sedentary way. We see similar sorts of things in games like chess. The chess grandmasters that are winning major tournaments are very fit individuals. It has nothing to do with the sport other than you have to be a really fit individual in order to be able to do that sport at the highest levels. And so for me, I think that's what I would like to see in esports space. If we're thinking about the sedentariness and that sort of movement towards a lack of activity, well, let's focus on the benefits of being a fit individual in order to maximize your performance in that activity. Let's not try to undermine that relationship by saying physical fitness doesn't matter. Let's put it in there as here's why you need to go out and do your training before you do, your 5 hours online or whatever, because you're going to get more out of that 5 hours if you're starting from a place of fitness.
And I think I'm not very well versed in the esports world either, but my youngest brother is, and I talk to him about it every now and then. And he tells me, the top guys, they do work out and they do have like a training regimen and mental training regimens as well as they're, playing their sport, playing the game. But I think one thing that maybe might be very different is that there is not a physical difference that would exist in the anthropometric data of the esports athletes. Like a 6'5" player is not going to be better than a 5'3" player. And so in almost no other sport would we see that today, right? Tall players are going to play sports for tall athletes and short players are going to play sports for short athletes, but that wouldn't really exist in esports. And so I'm not sure whether the talent identification, again, to use that term very loosely, as a skill might actually be better because we're selecting for more performance in the game versus like, oh, that kid's tall, he's going to be good when he's older. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think it's, I don't know that it's simpler because when you remove the physical stuff, when you remove the stuff that's actually easier to measure, the task becomes a lot more complicated. The fact that physical stuff doesn't matter actually makes the identification task more complicated because the things that do matter, maybe, grit, persistence, resilience, passion, maybe even cognitive skills like executive functioning, three-dimensional spatial reasoning, that kind of stuff. Well, those things probably make a difference in a virtual world. And they're so much more complicated to be able to assess and measure. It probably makes the talent identification task more difficult, not easier. It
presents new challenges and getting into the nitty gritty of other things, right? So yeah, it makes a lot of sense for sure. Do we see some of these same issues with talent identification across a business or in the corporate world, selecting someone who's going to be a top level, Bay Street lawyer? Do we see some sort of, maybe not the same effects, but similar things that are like these things that we wouldn't necessarily understand that or predict that would be a predictor of a good lawyer, but like the birth month of their birth month would predict? Do we see similar things across the corporate world?
We see it in education. I don't know that anybody's looked at it in the corporate world, but we definitely see it in grades in education, which we know predicts certain kinds of outcomes, university, your success, those kinds of things. So we probably see some indicator of it. the talent identification, it's interesting. I was on a podcast a couple of weeks ago where we talked about talent from a recruitment perspective for employers. And it's interesting because some of the things that we've worked out in sport, they haven't worked out in industry yet. And I think this, we see it all the time when organizations will have employees take standardized personality tests. There's a lot of these kind of fluffy ones out there to see what kind of, what colors are your employees, and you don't want your reds working with your greens and this kind of stuff, which puts people in a box, right? And we know that there's problems when you do that. And it's much more realistic and thoughtful, I think, to see your employees as capacities to be developed. The way that we're trying to change the narrative with athletes is they're not fixed. Don't look at them as being talented individuals that are fixed in terms of their capacity for growth and development. We need to be thinking about employees exactly the same way. Is at the moment you look like you're this, but I'm going to give you a bunch of opportunities and see what areas you thrive in, what areas are you getting the most out of, and then we'll figure out a tailored development schedule to help you thrive in that environment. Again, we'd get much more out of employees if we did that. They'd be more satisfied in their jobs. Productivity would go up. But we still have this tendency to kind of look at them as if they're fixed. If you're a blue, you're always going to be a blue. Well, no, that's not the way human development works.
It seems, or it sounds like we trade that talent label for a personality test label, and so it's not calling it talent, but it's calling it something else, because that workplace has identified that the blue personality types are better in the job, and that would just be a roundabout way of saying that person is more talented based on this personality test or whatever it is. So we always have this constant need to just label things, right? Which is I understand it. It's part of our psychology, and it helps us understand the world around us and where we fit in, but it also causes problems, obviously.
Yeah, and it's also like, you can understand why they do it, but it's a too simple a way of thinking about human development and human performance. And if there's one takeaway from 30 years of research in this field, is that anytime somebody thinks they have the answer, you can dismiss them almost immediately, because there isn't one answer. If you've got 1,000 employees, there's 1,000 answers. And so you need to figure out what's the answer for this employee at this point in time, knowing that the answer is going to change as the employee changes, as the environment changes, as the pushes and pulls in that environment change. So you need to be much more dynamic in your thinking.
Agreed. I think to start to wrap this up, for fear of going into Joe Rogan territory, as we discussed before recording, if we dismiss the idea of talent, or we don't subscribe to it any longer, and we understand that hard work, resiliency, grit, and time in the system, and these things are far and away well, first of all, they're the things that you can control more than your, again, quote unquote, talent. It can seem like, well, all I got to do is just work hard. If I want to be elite, if I want to make it to the pros, if I want to be LeBron James, I just got to grind and put my nose down and keep working. And I think, we extrapolate that. You want to be the best lawyer on Bay Street, you just got to keep working, all that stuff. But what people don't understand about this is they might not really understand how much work and how much sacrifice is truly involved in that. So it can be a slippery slope to say you want that, but you have to start to really understand what that means. It doesn't mean you play hard today. It means you play your hardest every single day for the rest of time. That's what it takes to be the absolute best. And so how do we go about, trying to moderate this? Well, I want to be elite, and helping people understand what that actually takes.
I think there's a couple of solutions there. One is getting them to understand the sacrifice that's necessary in order to be at that optimal level. And then the flip side of that is to get them to understand whether that's a sacrifice that they want to make. And also to devalue almost devalue the elite level a bit more than we do in our society right now, where, we got a lot of kids in sport, and if they're not playing at the elite level, a lot of them are like, well, why am I doing this? Well, most people are not going to end up at the, at the professional level or at the Olympics. And so you do it for the journey. You don't do it for the outcome. And I think we need to shift that in sport, but also everywhere, because, you can work harder and be a better lawyer on Bay Street, or, make more money, or those kinds of things. But here's what you lose when you do that. You don't spend as much time with your kids. You don't get enough free time to go on holidays. Okay, so now if we give you all of the pieces of information and you're a thoughtful adult, you can make those decisions for yourself. But we do that by disempowering this level of being the best. Some people are perfectly wired. A LeBron James or a Kobe Bryant or those kinds of athletes are perfectly wired to want to make those sacrifices. Most people are not. And it's fine to decide, I don't want to make more money. I want to spend more time with my kids. We need to change the focus in our society so that the participating at the elite level is not the only reason you do sport. Because again, to come back to something we talked about earlier, it undermines this lifespan engagement in sport that we want more people to be involved in. There's value in participating in sport at any level that you can do it in. And so find the one that fits for you and your values and what you want out of your life, and do it as much as possible. That's the way that we should be thinking about sport. And if that's at house league or rec or, a pickup pickleball at your local Y, amazing. That's great. But don't, and I have this discussion with my big third year class at York. If you think you don't like sport, it's because you haven't been exposed to the right sport yet, because sport is not a single thing. There's sports for everybody. And so if you think, sport's not for me, it's because you haven't found the right fit for you. And it's amazing how many people we see coming through their lifespan and they find a sport like pickleball when they turn 60 and they move to a retirement community or whatever. And it's like a light bulb goes off. This can be fun. I thought sport was something I should hate. We need to figure out how to make that transition for people. And I think part of it is devaluing this label of elite sport. Well, sport is something you do to go to the Olympics. Well, no, that's not why you do sport. Some people are lucky enough to be able to do that, but the majority of us should be doing it because it's amazing.
To translate that into, applicable to everyday people, the fitness version of that is someone who, and I deal with this fairly often. Someone comes in and says, I want to get to 8% body fat. And I say, okay, great. Here's what it's going to take. Do you still want to do that? Oh shit, that sounds like not something I want to do. Like, okay, great. Well, maybe we just get down to like 13% and let's adjust from there, because that seems a little bit more reasonable, or whatever it is for them. So it's like understanding knowing what you want, and then understanding what it actually takes to get that thing that you claim that you want. And then if you're willing to do what it takes to get that, then great, go ahead. If not, then, change the plan kind of thing. Right. And
exactly.
And even with fitness, like people say, I don't like working out. I don't enjoy working out. I don't enjoy strength training. Okay, that's fine. Like, obviously I'm biased. I enjoy it. It's what I do. It's a thing. I think there's extreme value in it for everyone. That's all fine. But if you absolutely hate it, then, you try spinning, you try a Zumba class, you try this thing, there's so many other things to try. And I think what you said is great. It's not that you don't like it. You just haven't found the one that's for you yet.
Yeah. And I think that's the important takeaway, right? Because, and I'm sure there are individuals out there, but the majority of us, we're all the same species. Our species is built for movement. It's built for activity. We're not made to sit in chairs for multiple hours a day. We're meant to be moving. And so if you don't enjoy that yet, I think it's an issue of exposure, as opposed to, the you being the one individual of the 7 billion of us that doesn't like to move. Maybe you're going to classes that are too focused on performance and not on enjoyment. Maybe you haven't found the right social group. Maybe you're embarrassed because you haven't been active enough. Well, these are all psychological things that we can manage.
Totally agree, and very well said, Dr. Baker. Thank you so much for your time. This has been amazing, and I'm sure that many people will enjoy this. Let people know where they can purchase the book, the title of the book, and your contact info if they want to just follow along for your updates. And I'll post everything in the show notes, but let us know. Sure.
So the book is called The Tyranny of Talent, how it Limits and Compels Athletic Achievement and Why You Should Ignore It. And Amazon is the best place to pick that up at the moment. But you can also follow me on Twitter at Baker J York U. I've also, if you search for Joe Baker, York University, you'll see my personal webpage. Any comments, feedback, I'm always happy to have discussions with people about this stuff. This is what I do all day. So I love chatting about talent and how it applies to people in different environments. So, thanks, Daniel, for the conversation. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much. The Tyranny of Talent, get it on Amazon, at Baker J York U on Twitter. I'll put the links in the show notes and all that stuff. Dr. Baker, is there any last message that you want to leave the people with here in closing?
Maybe just to, again, our big message across the whole conversation has been, if talent exists, we probably don't measure it very well. And so to the extent possible, forget about talent and focus on hard work and improving development in that overall process of human development and engagement. And don't think that there's going to be a one size fits all strategy. I think those are the big takeaways from not just the book, but I think our 20 years plus of doing research in this area. Beautiful. Agreed. Well said. Thank you very much again. Thank you everybody for listening. Follow at Baker J York U, The Tyranny of Talent. The book is available on Amazon everywhere. Follow the podcast. Follow me on everywhere, social media at Daniel Yoris. Like, share, subscribe, all those good things. Go outside. Be a good person. We'll see you next time.